Hello there, and welcome. Tonight, we're taking a slow journey through time as we explore the quiet beginnings of a man history would call Charlemagne, a ruler whose empire shaped Europe, yet whose story begins in silence and shadows. But before we begin, take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to see how far and wide this calm reaches, and how many of us are falling asleep together. And if you haven't already, tap the like button and subscribe to the channel. Do it now while you're still awake, because in just a few minutes your eyes will grow heavy and you won't want to move a muscle. Now, let's begin. In the year 742, or possibly 747, depending on which source you consult, a child was born somewhere in the Frankish kingdom. This child would later be known as Charles, or Carolus Magnus, or Charlemagne, which means Charles the Great. The precise location of his birth is unknown, though historians often suggest either Liege or Aachen, or perhaps a villa somewhere in present-day Belgium. His father, Pepin the Short, was the first Carolingian king, a man of short stature but long ambition. His mother, Bertrada of Leon, is said to have been wise and politically aware. Though few records remain of her influence, the world into which Charles was born was fragmented, filled with small kingdoms, tribal loyalties, and shifting alliances. The Merovingian dynasty, which had once ruled, had faded into ceremonial figureheads, replaced in power by Pepin, Charles' father, with the support of the Pope as a young boy. Charles would have been trained in the arts of war, horseback riding, swordsmanship, and possibly Latin and Frankish. Some say he learned to read, though he never truly learned to write, and dictated most of his letters and orders. Education in those times was a privilege of the clergy, not of kings or warriors. When Pepin died in 768, the kingdom was divided between Charles and his younger brother, Carloman. This division would not last long. Carloman died just 3 years later in 771, under mysterious or natural circumstances, depending on the chronicler you trust. Charles, now ruling alone, began the long and careful process of expanding his territory, strengthening his alliances, and shaping the destiny of what would later become known as the Holy Roman Empire. But at this early stage, he was simply Charles, a young ruler in a divided and uncertain land, stepping quietly into the currents of history. In the year 768, Pepin the Short, king of the Franks, breathed his last. His kingdom, divided according to Frankish tradition, was left to his two sons, Charles and Carloman, Charles the elder and Carloman the younger. The two brothers were crowned separately in separate cities, and from the beginning ruled separate lands. This division, though customary, was not without tension. The brothers, though bound by blood, were not bound in temperament. Charles was decisive, pragmatic, and inclined toward action. Carloman was more reserved, more devout, and perhaps more suspicious. Their realms, though adjacent, were ruled independently, with each brother issuing their own edicts, holding their own courts, and pursuing their own agendas. In theory, they were allies. In practice, their alliance was uneasy. Early in their reigns, a crisis emerged. In the region of Aquitaine, where Duke Hunald, a rebel noble, had risen once again, hoping to shake off Frankish control, Charles moved swiftly. With the support of loyal nobles and the backing of the church, he gathered troops and marched to suppress the rebellion. Carloman did not send aid. His absence, though not openly condemned, deepened the divide between the brothers. Charles prevailed in Aquitaine, and his reputation as a capable and commanding figure began to spread in the background. The papacy watched carefully. Pope Stephen III, and later Pope Adrian I, had vested interest in maintaining Frankish unity, for the papal states were often under threat from the Lombards in Italy. In Carloman's realm, tension grew. His court was unstable, his nobles disloyal, and his decisions questioned. Then, in the year 771, Carloman died suddenly at the age of 20. The cause of death remains uncertain. Some say it was natural, others whisper of illness or intrigue, but the records are quiet, and silence is often more telling than words. Carloman's wife and children fled, seeking refuge with the Lombards, who now became the enemies of Charles. With Carloman's passing, Charles assumed full control of the entire Frankish realm. His coronation, simple but complete, marked the beginning of a new era. He was no longer a divided ruler, no longer one king among two. He was, in every sense, the king of the Franks. The church recognized him, the nobles respected him, and the land, for the first time in years, stood under a single crown. He would not waste the opportunity. With the United Kingdom, Charles began to strengthen alliances, fortify borders, and prepare for the campaigns that would define his reign. But in these early years, his victories were quiet, and his strength still forming. He did not yet call himself emperor, but the foundations were being laid, and the man who had once shared power was now standing alone at the head of a kingdom, preparing to become the architect of empire. In the years following his rise to sole kingship, Charlemagne stood at the threshold of power, not yet emperor, but no longer simply a regional ruler. The lands of the Franks stretched from the sea to the Alps, rich in forests, rivers, and hills, but surrounded on all sides by uncertainty and ambition. One such region lay to the east, just beyond the Rhine River, a region wild and unconquered, a land ruled not by kings or bishops, but by tribes, ancient, fierce, and free. These were the Saxons. They did not build cities. They did not kneel before crosses. They lived in forests, in wooden villages, and worshipped gods older than Charlemagne's own church could name. They burned incense in sacred groves, prayed to spirits of thunder and sky, and gathered in hidden clearings, far from the stone churches of the Franks. And so they were considered a threat, not only to the Frankish borders, but to the Christian order itself. It began, as most wars do, not with ceremony, but with violence. In the year 772, a Saxon warband crossed the Rhine, raiding villages in the region of Austrasia. Churches were burned, priests were killed, livestock taken. It was not the first raid, but it would be the last unanswered ... Charlemagne gathered his forces. Unlike the Saxons, his army wore chainmail, carried long swords, and marched in formations that stretched for miles. He crossed the Rhine and began his first campaign into Saxony. The Saxons did not meet him in open battle. They scattered, burned their own villages, and vanished into the thick forests, where the trees grew tall, and the paths were known only to them. But Charlemagne did not leave. He moved slowly, village to village, burning altars, felling sacred trees, and forcing oaths from tribal leaders. Some submitted, some vanished, some plotted revenge. In these early years, the war was not one war, but many. Each season brought new skirmishes, new betrayals, new uprisings, and each time Charlemagne returned. He built fortresses along the rivers, installed Frankish garrisons, appointed bishops to newly conquered towns. The church sent missionaries with crosses in hand and parchments of scripture to teach a people who had no letters and no interest in learning them. Among the Saxons, a leader emerged. His name was Wittikind. He wore no crown, held no official title, but he commanded loyalty. Wittikind knew the forests, knew the rivers, and knew how to disappear. He struck at night, burned fortresses, and vanished by dawn. Charlemagne's victories were followed by defeats. His baptized Saxon lords abandoned the faith as soon as his armies withdrew. Again and again, the pattern repeated: conquest, conversion, rebellion, fire, cross, sword. For over 20 years, the Saxon wars continued. They were not glorious battles. They were not swift. They were long, drawn-out struggles, waged in forests, by soldiers who could not see their enemy and feared the silence more than the sword. In the year 774, Charlemagne paused his Saxon campaigns to respond to a call from the Pope to march into Italy against the Lombards. He would return again and again to Saxony. In 781, he ordered mass baptisms at the banks of rivers, thousands at a time, men, women, and children forced to kneel in foreign tongues before a faith they did not yet understand. In 784, the forests burned again. Wittikind had returned. The Frankish garrisons fell. Churches were destroyed. The war was far from over. In 785, Wittikind surrendered. Charlemagne himself stood as his sponsor at the baptismal font and watched as his most elusive enemy accepted the Christian faith, or at least appeared to. The act was symbolic, for the war did not truly end. Resistance would continue in pockets, in whispers, and in the dark spaces of the forest. But the tides had turned. Charlemagne had broken the back of the Saxon resistance at great cost. Thousands had died, villages vanished, and among the Franks, the idea of holy war had taken root. Not merely war for land, but war for souls. In the long silence that followed, the empire began to shift. It was no longer just a kingdom, it was becoming something else, ... A spiritual dominion where kings wore armor and priests carried swords. The Saxon wars were not just a campaign of conquest, they were a blueprint for the empire to come. And Charlemagne, though still king in title, was already, in the eyes of many, an emperor in waiting, not by proclamation, but by persistence, not crowned in gold, but forged in forest fire and faith. It began not with armies, but with letters, letters penned in Rome by the hand of Pope Adrian I, whose ink dried slowly in candlelight, whose parchment carried the weight of centuries. Rome, once the heart of empire, was now fragile, a city of stone walls and ancient churches, guarded more by prayer than by sword. To the north, in the Po Valley, stood the Lombards, a people descended from wandering tribes, now settled, now crowned, now sovereign. Their kingdom was not Roman, but it wore the robes of Rome, their kings crowned by bishops, their courts filled with Latin scribes, and their cities filled with monks and merchants and quiet ambitions. Desiderius, the king of the Lombards, ruled from Pavia, a city of stone towers and narrow streets. He was not cruel, but he was cautious, and he watched Rome the way wolves watch distant fires. Years earlier, Desiderius had sought peace through marriage. His daughter, Desiderata, was given to Charlemagne, a bond of blood between two crowns. But Charlemagne dissolved the marriage without battle, without insult, without explanation. Desiderius was left dishonored, and so he looked south to Rome and wondered if its walls could be breached. Pope Adrian saw the signs. He saw Lombard soldiers near the border. He heard whispers in the market squares, and he wrote line by line a plea to Charlemagne, king of the Franks, protector of the church. The letter was carried over mountains and valleys by a monk on muleback, through snow, through wind, through silence. Charlemagne read it, alone in the stone halls of Aachen, and for days he said nothing, but in his mind the wheels had turned. He summoned his war council. He spoke not of conquest, but of duty, of faith, of Rome. The Alps stood between him and Italy, tall, cold, and unmoved, but Charlemagne moved anyway. His armies gathered, not in fury, but in preparation. Oxen were yoked, carts were loaded, iron was sharpened. Priests walked among the soldiers, offering quiet blessings. The path into Italy was steep, but step by step they climbed . The wind howled through the peaks. Snow fell upon helmets and cloaks. Horses slipped. Men whispered prayers, and slowly the Franks descended into the Po Valley. They did not find war waiting. They found walls, high, thick, and patient, the walls of Pavia. Desiderius had locked his gates, and Charlemagne did not knock . They built camps, dug trenches, and waited. The siege of Pavia began not with swords, but with silence. Desiderius believed the Franks would leave. They did not. Instead, they sang songs at sunrise and built wooden towers by moonlight. For months, no arrow was loosed, no charge was given. The Franks simply stayed. Around them the grass grew high, and inside the city food grew scarce. Outside the walls, messengers came and went, not just from the Frankish nobles, but from Rome. Pope Adrian had summoned Charlemagne, not just for protection, but for ceremony, and Charlemagne answered. He rode to Rome, not in armor, But in white wool, escorted by bishops and guards, the city opened to him as to a savior. Crowds gathered in the streets. Priests swung censers. Children held olive branches, and in the Lateran, Pope Adrian and Charlemagne met. No record tells us what was said, only that prayers were offered and oaths were renewed. The church and the sword together. And then Charlemagne returned to Pavia to finish what had begun in silence. The siege continued. Weeks became months. The sun rose over the same fields and set behind the same towers. The Franks did not grow restless. They were patient. They built ovens. They dug wells. They waited. Inside Pavia, the mood changed. At first, Desiderius promised victory. Then he promised deliverance. Then he simply stopped speaking. Grain stores emptied. Rats grew bold. The citizens began to whisper. They wondered how long a king could sit on a throne if the people beneath him had nothing left to eat. Outside the walls, Charlemagne received updates from Rome. Pope Adrian wrote of gifts, of restored churches, of relics returned to their altars, and more importantly, of oaths. New lands were being promised to the church. Lands once claimed by the Lombards, now gifted to God, but only if Charlemagne prevailed. The siege stretched into a second season. Still no great battle, still no retreat. Charlemagne was not known for speed. He was known for persistence. In July of the year 776, the gates of Pavia opened. Slowly, silently. No trumpet, no sword, just a creak of timber and the footsteps of surrender. Desiderius, king of the Lombards, walked down from his tower. His crown was still on his head, his robes still gold-threaded, but his power was gone. Charlemagne met him in the quiet and accepted his surrender without insult. Desiderius was sent to a monastery. There he would live out his days, not as a prisoner, but as a monk, praying in silence. His name would not rise again. Charlemagne took the crown, not in ceremony, not in grandeur, but in function. He was now king of the Franks, king of the Lombards. 2 titles, 1 ruler. For the first time, the northern half of Italy answered not to a Roman remnant, nor to a wandering tribe, but to a single authority beyond the Alps. The people of Pavia waited for retribution, but none came. No fires, no executions. Instead, Charlemagne kept the peace. He installed Frankish officials, not to punish, but to govern. He kept many Lombards in place. Bishops remained in their seats. Markets reopened, and slowly trust returned. In Rome, bells rang. The Pope declared Charlemagne the rightful protector of the Church in Italy. Adrian I inscribed his gratitude. In letters and in stone, he gifted the donation of Constantine, a document, possibly forged but powerful. A grant claiming that Roman emperors of old had given spiritual authority to the Bishop of Rome. With this, the papacy claimed dominion over central Italy, and Charlemagne was the sword that enforced that claim. He stayed in Italy not for days, but for years. He did not return home in haste. He walked the streets of Pavia He oversaw councils, he issued decrees, and in each act, he bound the North and the South into one realm. Coins were minted, bearing his name in Frankish Latin and Lombard script, gold and silver, with a single message that Charlemagne was now more than a warlord. He was a king by divine favor. From the plains of Aachen to the rivers of Milan, in monasteries, his name was added to prayers, ... in cathedrals. His image was painted into murals, not in armor, but in robes, holding a scepter and a book. The book was always the same, the Gospels, Charlemagne, the Christian king, defender of the church. The title grew without him ever needing to speak it. But the question remained, what would become of the rest of Italy? For now, Charlemagne stayed in the north. In Benevento, in the far south, a Lombard duchy still held power, but it was isolated, surrounded by papal land and by silence. Charlemagne did not need to conquer it. He simply waited, and in time it bent to his influence. His authority was not like the Caesars. He did not need legions. He used monks, diplomats, law, and in every corner of Italy, his name became a boundary, a line between peace and rebellion. Those who accepted it were left in peace. Those who challenged it were erased from memory. Charlemagne's court now stretched across the mountains. Messengers traveled between Pavia and Aachen, scrolls, seals, commands, a network not of conquest, but of control. And in Rome, the Pope watched it all, grateful but cautious. For now, Charlemagne was a king, but how long before he would become something more? An emperor? A Caesar? A sovereign above the church itself? These questions were whispered, but not yet answered. Charlemagne returned north slowly. He passed through valleys, visited abbeys, left gifts, and received homage. At the edge of the Alps, he turned once to look south, toward Rome, toward memory, and toward a destiny that was no longer his alone, but tied to the soul of Europe itself. The campaign in Italy had ended, but the transformation it began had only just begun. The Saxons had never fully submitted, even when their leaders knelt, even when their warriors laid down their arms. The forests remained untouched, and in those forests, the old gods still breathed. For every church built, there was a sacred oak that stood untouched. For every priest that preached, there was a circle of stones where fire still flickered beneath the open sky. The Saxons did not forget. They endured, silent but watching, waiting. After Charlemagne's first campaigns, there was quiet. He had crossed the Rhine, taken hostages, built forts, and left behind the cross and the sword. But the Saxons were not like the Lombards. They had no cities, no crown, only forests, rivers, and tribes. They lived not under kings, but among chieftains. And when Charlemagne turned his eyes to Italy, the Saxons saw their chance. The fires returned, churches burned, monasteries plundered, ... Frankish garrisons slaughtered. The war had returned, but this was no single battle. It was a movement. Across rivers, through thick woods, messages passed from village to village in the old tongue, calling for vengeance. And at the heart of it all was a name, Wittekind, a Saxon noble, who had once bent the knee but now had vanished into the trees. He would not fight in open fields. He would not wear a crown, but he would speak. And the people listened. They gathered not in palaces, but in sacred groves, not around thrones, but around the Irmensal, the great pillar, the axis of the world, a sacred trunk, rising from the earth, touching the sky. It was not a god, but a gateway between the seen and the unseen to the Saxons. The Irmensal was not simply wood. It was the center of everything, ... And so long as it stood, they were free. Charlemagne heard of the rebellion. He did not rage. He did not shout. He prepared. Again, he crossed the Rhine, this time with more men, more supplies, more priests. And he went straight to the Irmensal. He did not negotiate. He gave no warning. He ordered it, burned. The flames rose high. Smoke coiled into the branches above, and the sacred wood cracked and collapsed. The gods had not stopped it, and Charlemagne watched in silence. He did not smile. For him, it was not a victory. It was a necessity. The forests groaned, the Saxons wept, and the war grew darker. Villages were emptied, fields were burned. For every Saxon tribe that surrendered, another vanished into the woods. Baptisms were held by force. Lines of men, wet from the river, stood silently as Latin prayers were read. Words they did not understand, some resisted. They were hanged, others ran, they were hunted. The Frankish army moved like a storm, slow but relentless. No walls to besiege, no kings to conquer, only trees and time, and yet still the Saxons fought. From the ashes of the Irmensal, the Saxons rose again, not in anger, but in resolve. The Frankish banners flew high over the burned groves, yet in the deep woods, Wittekind returned, not with a trumpet, not with an army, but with a whisper. It moved from village to village, from mouth to ear, carried not in written letters, but in memory. Wittekind lived, and the Saxons still had their spirit. Charlemagne now moved with greater force. His court debated peace, but his heart leaned toward iron. He had tried diplomacy, and it had burned away with the monasteries. He sent messengers to the bishops to summon more priests and to prepare more baptisms, not by persuasion, but by decree. Baptism or exile, baptism or death. In the capitularies of Saxony, Charlemagne wrote laws against worshiping the old gods, laws against refusing baptism, laws against rebelling. The punishment was always the same: death, 20 articles, cold, unforgiving, not written to convert, but to control. The monks who copied these laws did not smile. They understood what it meant. The sword now walked beside the cross. In one hand, salvation. In the other, execution. The Saxons saw no difference. Villages were emptied. Men and women fled into the hills. And Wittekind began to strike, not in daylight, not in open battle, but at night in the fog. One camp burned here. A patrol vanished there. Frankish supplies stolen, bridges collapsed, priests killed in silence. It was not war, it was resistance. Charlemagne grew impatient. He returned to Saxony again and again and again. Every campaign, another fire. Every river crossed, another oath broken. He began to question not his mission, but its purpose. He believed he had been chosen to bring light to dark lands, chosen to spread the faith where idols stood. But the idols would not fall, and the Saxons would not forget. Each time he returned, they vanished into the forest. No fortress, no battlefield, just trees and blood, and every time he left, they returned. The land itself seemed to resist him. Rivers flooded his roads. Winds scattered his tents, as though the gods of the Saxons had not truly died, but simply stepped aside, waiting for his strength to fade. The priests called it demonic. The soldiers called it cursed. Charlemagne called it unfinished. And he pressed on, into deeper valleys, into darker woods. The path forward was no longer paved with victory. It was paved with silence. And that silence grew heavier. The year turned and turned again. Charlemagne grew older, but the war remained young. The Saxons would not break, not with fire, not with baptism, not even with death. The Frankish king no longer spoke of conquest. He spoke of judgment, of law, of obedience. And so, a new decree was issued, one that would be remembered for centuries. In a field near Verdun, 4,500 Saxon captives were gathered. Their crimes were rebellion. Their punishment was death. No trial, no appeal, only the blade. One by one, they fell. The air filled with silence, then smoke, then prayers. The Franks called it justice. The church looked away, and the Saxons called it vengeance. Wittgenstein was not among them. He had vanished once more into the trees, into memory, into legend. Charlemagne returned to Aachen, but not in triumph. His court was silent. His priests offered no songs. In the still halls of his palace, he walked alone. Had he done God's work or his own? The Saxons were not conquered. They were merely punished, and punishment was not peace. His scribes wrote new laws, harsh laws, each article a blade, theft of church property, death, refusal of baptism, death, assault on a priest, death. To resist the Franks was to resist the will of heaven, or so the parchment claimed. But the forests told another story. The Saxons began to hide their faith. By day they attended Mass. By night they prayed to Woden. They knelt before stone altars carved deep in the woods. They buried their old idols and dug them up again when the soldiers passed. A quiet resistance, not with swords, but with memory. Charlemagne sent more priests. Monasteries rose on old tribal grounds. Latin replaced Saxon in the records, but the people remembered, and every child born in secret, every ritual whispered in shadows, became a seed of rebellion, and the cycle began again. Revolt, punishment, baptism, rebellion, over and over, until even the Franks began to tire. Some knights refused to return to Saxony. Some monks began to question the mission. Even the Pope offered only silence. Charlemagne sat at his writing desk, a single candle ... a single scroll, and a single thought. What if faith could not be forced? What if war could not plant peace? He did not write the answer. He simply closed his eyes and listened to the wind outside his hall, whispering like the breath of 1,000 Saxon trees. And then, without warning, the rebellion stopped. The raids ceased. The forests grew quiet. No flames, no messengers, just wind and the sound of water flowing through empty valleys. One morning, a rider arrived in Aachen, his cloak soaked from rain, ... His message, simple. Wittekind had come forward, not with an army, not with a sword, but alone, ... At the Frankish outpost in Attigny, the most hunted man in Saxony had surrendered. He asked for no terms. He made no demand. He asked only to speak with the king. Charlemagne received him. The court expected change, but none were used. Wittekind entered in silence, a tall man, weathered, ... thin, his eyes dark. They stood across from one another. One had ruled from palaces, the other from forests. They shared no words for a long time, and then Wittekind bowed, ... slowly, fully, not to a man, but to an idea, that the war had gone on long enough. He accepted baptism. In the cathedral at Attigny, candles flickered, incense rose, and the font was filled. Frankish nobles stood around him. Priests held books, and the Saxon stepped forward. Water touched his brow, a name was spoken, Otto. It meant wealth, but to Charlemagne it meant peace. For a moment the king exhaled. Years of war, thousands dead, cities burned, all for this, a single man kneeling at a basin. But it was not joy that filled the court, it was stillness, a strange, uncertain stillness, for they all knew that peace achieved by fatigue was not the same as peace by belief. Wittekind rose. He said nothing. He took no title. He returned to Saxony not as a king, but as a man. The war was over, at least for now. In the years that followed, Charlemagne sent teachers, not soldiers, priests, not patrols. He ordered churches, schools, places of learning to be built across Saxon lands. Roads were paved, markets reopened, ... Latin words echoed through halls once filled with runes. And in time, the Saxons changed, but they did not forget. Their hills remembered, their rivers remembered, their children learned the Frankish tongue, but in secret some still whispered the old names. And deep in the woods, in places untouched by the cross, the stones still stood, unmoved, unbroken, silent, just like the man who had once been Wittekind, just like the king who had conquered a people, but never their soul. The Saxon rebellion had ended, but the echo would last forever. The rivers no longer ran red, but they still ran fast. The wind through the trees no longer carried smoke, but it still carried memory. The war was over, but peace was fragile. After Wittekind's baptism, Saxony entered a new phase, not of conquest, but of control. Charlemagne now sought not to defeat the Saxons, but to change them, to transform a forest people into Christians, into Franks, into subjects. He issued edicts not for battle, but for belief. Every village must have a church. Every Saxon child must be baptized. The prayers of the old gods were now punishable by death. And yet, even in peace, the Saxons resisted, not with spears, but with silence. They nodded to priests, but muttered different names when the sun set. They entered the churches, but left no footprints in the snow around the altar. They listened, but they did not hear. Monks recorded the conversions in their ledgers, but not in the hearts of the people. In many villages, the cross stood next to the sacred oak, and the people bowed to both. Charlemagne sent more bishops. He built monasteries across the Saxon lands. Some grew, some thrived, others were burned in the night. No army, no rebellion, just fire, a reminder that the forest still watched, still judged, still remembered. In court, Charlemagne passed new legal codes. The Saxon capitulary was rewritten. The death penalties were softened, at least on parchment. The laws were now about behavior: work the land, pay the tithe, attend the mass. Outward obedience became the measure of peace. But inwardly, the Saxons remained distant, and so Charlemagne changed his strategy. He stopped trying to destroy Saxon identity. He tried instead to absorb it. He brought Saxon nobles to Aachen. He gave them lands and Frankish territory. He married their daughters to Frankish lords. He made their children speak Latin. The sword was replaced by the school. But even this brought unease. In the monasteries, monks taught reading and prayer, yet they saw the hesitation in the eyes of their pupils. Some students prayed in Latin by day and in Saxon by night. They drew runes in the margins of their psalters. They carved old gods into the undersides of benches. They carried two worlds in their minds, and both were heavy. The Franks called it progress, but it was a mask, and masks do not last forever. Beneath the surface of this new peace, small fires began to smolder: quiet disobedience, hidden gatherings, the kindling of yet another rebellion. And Charlemagne, once again, felt the chill of unfinished work. The peace was thin. It hung in the air like fog, present, but ready to vanish with the wind. In the deep valleys of Eastphalia, a shrine was found, Hidden, carved into stone. Behind a waterfall, the figures were not saints. They bore the faces of Woden and Donar and the nameless spirits of the forest. A priest who discovered it fled. Word spread, and the fires returned, not across all Saxony, but in pockets. Quiet resistance gave way to violent memory. A Frankish outpost in Nordalbinja burned to the ground. A bishop's caravan disappeared along a forest road. A village that refused to send tithes was found abandoned, its cross shattered, its church emptied of altar and bell. Charlemagne was tired. He had marched, he had preached, he had executed, he had baptized nations with steel, but the soul cannot be conquered. Still, he returned to the field. This time, not with the full force of the Frankish army, but with swift punishment. Small legions, mounted patrols. They moved quickly. They silenced what they found. The rebellion never reached the scale of Wittekind's time, but it burned like a fever. Not enough to kill the empire, but enough to haunt it. In the monasteries, monks began to write less about war and more about weariness. One wrote, "We teach the Gospels, but the woods do not listen. Another wrote, "The altar stands firm, but the hearts of the people remain in shadow." Some monks fled the Saxon frontier altogether. Others stayed, but with eyes dulled by futility. They planted olive trees, they tilled the earth, but their prayers grew softer. Even the soldiers began to change. They no longer celebrated victories. They counted the days until they could go home. What began as a holy war had become a habit. Orders were followed. Towns were patrolled. Converts were listed. But the flame had gone out. In Aachen, Charlemagne stood before his map. Pins marked every river, every village, every battle site. He had crossed the Rhine more than a dozen times. He had won every war, and yet he felt no victory. What was the purpose of empire? If the people within it did not love its heart, what was the point of peace if it had to be enforced by sword and law? He wrote letters to his bishops. He asked for advice. He asked for meaning. But the replies were shallow. They spoke of conversions, of taxes paid, of new chapels built, but they said nothing about faith. Charlemagne began to visit the chapels alone, late at night. No guards, no courtiers, just stone walls and silence and questions. The psalms echoed off the arches, but brought no answers. He had brought the gospel to the wild, but the wild had not become gospel. The rebellion had faded, but the scars remained, not on the land, on the soul, and they would never fully heal. The emperor returned to Saxony, not with soldiers, not with banners, but with silence, his beard now streaked with gray, his stride slower, his thoughts heavier. He rode without armor, just a cloak and a staff. Beside him, monks. Behind him, scribes, not to conquer, but to understand. They passed through villages, rebuilt from ash timber homes, fields of rye. Children played in the roads. The churches stood tall, yet quiet, crosses above the doors. But on the hearthstones, runes carved in shadow. Charlemagne did not order them removed. He did not speak of punishment. He simply watched. He sat with village elders, listened to stories of snowstorms, of wolves, of old gods who now walked unseen. They spoke to him not as a ruler, but as a man. He did not interrupt, he did not command. He listened as though each word might be the key to understanding why the rebellion had never truly died. And slowly he began to see the Saxons were not simply resisting him, they were resisting absence, the absence of their gods, the absence of their rhythm, the absence of place. To be ruled was not the wound. To be replaced was one elder, old as the trees, said this: "The cross is not the problem, my lord. The forgetting is." That night, Charlemagne did not sleep. He sat outside, beneath the stars, no guard, no crown, just sky and memory. Somewhere the bones of Wittekind lay in the earth. No monument marked the place. No hymn was sung for him, but his name was still spoken, still respected. Not for his victories, but for his defiance. Charlemagne closed his eyes, and in the hush of the forest, he whispered a prayer, not for himself, not for his empire, but for understanding. The next day, he ordered no new laws, no new taxes. He simply spoke, one village at a time, of balance, Of faith not by force, of memory and mercy some wept, some turned away, but all listened. He returned to Aachen, changed ... not weaker, not defeated, but aware that the true work of an emperor was not to conquer lands, but to understand people, not to erase their stories, but to walk beside them. Years passed, the forests grew thicker, and the roads more worn. The churches no longer stood empty. Monks taught children to write. Women lit candles at altars. Bells rang across the valleys. The old gods were no longer worshipped, but their names were remembered, and stories and symbols. In the quiet way, some Saxons touched the bark of certain trees as they passed, not worship. Memory. Charlemagne no longer marched. He ruled, and in Saxony, he ruled lightly. No more mass executions, no more pillars burned. He appointed Saxon bishops. He allowed their elders to govern. Under Frankish law, the rebellion had not only shaped the Saxons, it had shaped him. In Aachen, the palace grew. The schools flourished. Pilgrims arrived from distant lands to see the great king who had brought Christendom into the north. But in the quiet hours, Charlemagne still remembered the woods, the oaks, the smoke, the man with the eyes of the storm, who knelt in silence and said no final words. Wittekin, the ghost of Saxony. There were no more uprisings. The children of the rebels became priests. Their sons became scribes. Their daughters sang in monasteries. A generation passed. Then another. The Saxons became part of the empire, but in their songs still lived the cadence of the old drums. In their festivals still echoed the rhythm of the solstice. Not rebellion, not refusal, just remembrance, ... a quiet survival. Inside the walls of a faith they did not choose, but slowly accepted. Charlemagne died years later, crowned as Emperor of the Romans ... father of Europe, victor over the Saxons. But even in death, the land he struggled most to hold did not weep. It stood still, not out of loyalty, not out of grief, but out of memory, for Saxony remembered everything. The fire, the cross, the tree, the silence, and in that silence the legacy of Charlemagne remained, not as a conqueror, not as a saint, but as a man who tried to hold two worlds in one hand and learned that hands grow tired, that swords grow heavy, and that peace must be planted, not imposed. The Saxon rebellion was no longer a war, it was a memory, and like all memories, it waited ... beneath the earth, beneath the roots, beneath the sound of the bells, until one day, perhaps, it would rise again, not in fire, but in song. Before the dawn, the palace was quiet. No banners fluttered, no horns called, only the wind moving through the courtyard, like an old monk's whisper. Inside, embers glowed in stone hearths. Servants moved, soft as shadows. They carried buckets of water, poured cold into basins. They stirred the coals until a small flame flickered. Charlemagne did not rise with a shout. He rose with a prayer, hands over heart, eyes to the wooden beams, where spider webs caught the first hints of dawn. He breathed, not as a king, not yet, but as a man remembering the weight of crowns and the silence of winter. In Aachen, The walls held the warmth, stone and timber, thick furs draped over doorways, candles burned low. Outside, horses stamped in the frost. Inside, scribes prepared their quills. Pages waited to be filled. The chapel bell had not yet rung, but the court was already waking. Bread rose in the kitchens, yeast and heat, and the soft hands of women who did not speak of empires. They knew the taste of hunger. They knew that even kings grow cold and tired. So they baked loaves to be broken, broth to be stirred, wine to be warmed over coals. The Palatine Chapel stood in the dark, tall, octagonal, Roman in its bones, Frankish in its breath. Inside, no gold dripped from the walls. No choir sang yet, only a hush, a promise, a place where prayers and politics touched the same stones. Before the dawn, the scholars stirred. Alcuin of York bent over a scroll. Ink stained his fingers. His lips moved, silently rehearsing lines of Latin. Young boys, half asleep, traced letters in wax, dreams and alphabets, mixing in the drifting candlelight. Charlemagne moved among them, boots soft on cold floors. A nod to Alcuin, a word for a boy, too tired to hold his stylus straight. No thunder of authority, no weight of iron, just presence. Outside, the forests waited, frost on branches, wolves in distant hollows. Beyond the walls, tribes remembered old gods, old ways. But inside these walls, new words were born, new laws whispered into existence by ink and parchment. Before the dawn, the king prayed once more, not for conquest, not for crowns, but for the patience to hold a realm, stitched together by bread and books and the quiet trust of men who still spoke many tongues. The bell rang once, then twice. The court breathed in. The day began. The hall filled slowly, footsteps, whispers, the rustle of robes, lords arrived. Bishops followed. Messengers carried words, unspoken until this moment. The fire flickered. Shadows danced on stone. Faces were quiet, eyes were sharp. No sword flashed here, no banner raised, only the weight of law, and the breath of waiting. The king sat, calm, unmoved by haste. He listened, not with ears alone, but with heart. Words came like river stones, smooth, A dispute over land, a claim to grain, a plea for justice. He spoke little. His silence was a command. The scribe wrote, ink flowing like quiet rain, marking history's slow turn. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, cold and relentless. But inside, warmth held, held tight by the spoken word. Laws shaped like rivers, flowing through time, binding people, holding kingdoms whole. The court was a web, threads invisible, but strong, each knot a promise, Each word a bond. The king's gaze met theirs, a steady flame, neither soft nor cruel, just present. Decisions fell like leaves, gentle yet certain, and in the quiet, a peace was woven. The scholars waited nearby, scrolls stacked in ordered towers. Alcuin spoke softly, teaching, not with thunder, but with steady patience. Words were seeds, planted deep in young minds. Letters danced on parchment, the silent music. The court was a garden, not of flowers, but of knowledge, growing slowly, rooted in faith, nurtured by hope. The midday bell called, voices lifted in prayer, hands clasped, heads bowed, a moment held, suspended between earth and heaven. Charlemagne's breath slowed, the weight of empire momentarily lifted. Outside, the wind sang through the trees, a hymn to the unseen, a promise to the coming night. The court exhaled, a soft breath, and the day moved forward, not with a shout, but with the steady drum of duty. The fire burned low, its glow softened the stone walls. Shadows lengthened, stretching like slow fingers across the wooden tables. In the great hall, voices hushed, words measured, each sentence a thread. In the tapestry of rule, Charlemagne sat, not above them, but among them, a king who carried the weight of worlds in his steady hands. He spoke softly, not commands, but questions. Why this law? Who will carry the burden? What will bind us? When the fires grow cold, his counsel answered, not with noise, but with thought, careful, deliberate thought, like monks copying texts. In candlelight, the power here was quiet, like the turning of seasons, like the first snow on branches, like the slow melt of ice outside the windows. The land stretched wide, fields blanketed in frost, villages waking slowly. Inside, the king's word was law, not because of swords, but because of trust. Trust built on bread shared, on promises kept, on justice handed down like a gentle flame, not a blazing fire. The Misi Domenici rode out at dawn, watchful eyes, bringing news, carrying orders, binding empire together with thread and word. In the scholar's chamber, Alcuin's voice rose, soft, steady, teaching letters, shaping minds, building futures. Young scribes copied texts, their fingers stained with ink, learning to preserve what kings and soldiers could not hold. Words were the quiet power that outlasted stone, that outlived swords. Charlemagne knew this, and so did the court. The night deepened, candles flickered low, and the palace breathed with the life of a kingdom, not loud, not boastful, but steady like a heart that beats beneath armor. The court was more than stone, more than law, more than crowns. It was a promise, a whisper, a memory held in the silence between words. The night deepens, stars flicker, silent sentinels. Above cold rooftops, the palace sleeps, not in rest, but in waiting. Walls remember footsteps, soft echoes of those who shaped a fragile empire Charlemagne's breath slows, hands folded, eyes closed. He dreams of woods, of rivers that flow beyond the stone. He dreams of voices, old gods, whispering in forgotten tongues. He dreams of children, scribes and scholars, whose pens will carry his story beyond the night. The court, too, waits, not for glory, not for war, but for peace. A peace built on silence, on trust, on memory. The bells will ring again. The bread will be broken again. The ink will flow, and in the quiet, the legacy will grow. Not as thunder, not as flame, but as a steady flame that warms. The long winter ahead, the empire is a song, notes woven through time, sometimes soft, sometimes fierce, but always held in the breath. Between words, Charlemagne's court is not a kingdom of noise, but a kingdom of silence, a silence that speaks of patience, of endurance, of a man who held the world in quiet hands. And so the story rests, not finished, not forgotten, waiting like the first light of dawn until it rises again. Winter came early that year, snow on the roads, ice on the branches, silence in the forests. Where men once marched with banners, Charlemagne did not ride alone. Behind him, a procession moved like a river, counts and knights, priests and monks, pilgrims wrapped in furs, children clinging to mothers. They carried no thunder of war, no siege engines, no iron battering rams, only prayers and the hope that Rome would open its gates. Each morning they rose before dawn, boots on frozen ground, hands warmed over small fires, bread passed from sleeve to sleeve, hard crust softened with wine. The king rode at the head, silent, his beard frosted white, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Yet somewhere far behind, too, he thought of Aachen, of scholars gathered in smoky rooms, of Alcuin's quiet voice spelling out lines of Latin. He thought of the Saxon forests, the trees that did not bow, the smoke rising. When villages fell silent, he thought of crowns, how heavy they seemed when carried in dreams. At dusk, they reached small towns, stone huts, old walls that once felt Roman, a hearth offered by a farmer, a corner of straw for a squire, and the flicker of torches, faces blurred into memory, a child with wide eyes, an old woman tracing the sign of the cross on the king's cloak. God keep you, she whispered. But in Charlemagne's mind, the words echoed different. God keep the road, God keep the crown, God keep the faith that holds an empire. When winter winds tried to tear it apart, in the forests, wolves howled, men tightened cloaks around their necks, swords rested by their beds, but no enemy came, for this was no campaign, no conquest of steel and fire. This was a pilgrimage, a journey to bind power with blessings. At river crossings, they waited for boats. Ice broke under oars, horses trembled on wooden decks. As cold mist rose from black water, the king's breath drifted like incense, his hands folded inside thick gloves. No royal decree, no harsh command, only the patience of a man who knew that some crowns cannot be taken by force. Along the road, stories spread ahead of them. The Frankish king comes, the hammer sung, the father of the north, the scourge of pagans, the light of Christendom, ... In some huts, They whispered his name as if it burned the tongue. In others, they laid branches across doorways, a charm against spirits, against the weight of a king, too large for their world. Nights fell long. The stars watched from black fields. The procession huddled around small fires, faces hidden in the smoke. Some prayed, some dreamed of Rome, golden domes, marble arches, the whispers of saints in candlelight. Charlemagne did not sleep deeply. He rose when the wind howled hardest. He walked among the sleeping men, boots crunching snow. A king, carrying the ghost of a crown, not yet laid upon his head. In the darkest hours, he wondered if Leo would betray him, if the Pope's blessing would come with chains. He wondered if old Rome would swallow him whole, if the echoes of emperors would laugh behind the ancient stones. He wondered if God truly called him to wear the name of Caesar, or if men had shaped this moment with hands trembling from fear and hope alike. Yet when dawn broke, he mounted his horse, steel under saddle, leather reins cold in his grip. He did not speak of doubt. He did not speak of ghosts. He led them on through villages that smelled of wood smoke, over bridges older than his crown. Some days the road was soft mud. Wagons sank, boots sucked under, pulled free with curses. Other days snow fell so thick the world disappeared. Men tied ropes around their waists to keep from wandering into whiteness forever. Through it all, the king rode steady, a figure cut from frost and fire, his breath the promise of a realm no storm could swallow. In the valleys, pilgrims joined them, men in tattered cloaks, women with children at breast. They carried crosses, carved from pine branches. They did not march for riches. They came to see the crowning of a king who might become more, a king who might bind old Rome. To the cold forests of the north, as they neared the city, the road widened, stone beneath hoof, ruins on every side, columns split by time, arches half buried by moss. The city rose behind ancient gates, walls patched and broken, church spires cutting the dawn sky, bells tolling a hymn, older than any Frankish tongue, and above all, the great basilica, St. Peter's bones resting beneath marble floors, a throne that waited for a king to kneel. Charlemagne looked upon Rome, a city older than his line, older than his dreams. In its stones, he felt the ghosts of emperors who thought themselves gods. He felt the prayers of saints who had defied kings. He felt the weight of the crown, not yet his, a crown that promised unity and warned of ruin. The people gathered along the road, peasants, priests, nobles, eyes wide, voices hushed. Some knelt, some reached for his cloak, as if touching cloth might bless their fields for spring. He did not wave, he did not smile. He rode through them, like a shadow moving between old world and new ... At the gates, Pope Leo waited, vestments heavy with gold thread, hands raised in welcome or in warning. Charlemagne dismounted, the city behind the Pope, the road behind the king. Snow fell in thin veils. A hush held the crowd. Two men faced each other, one with no sword, one with no crown, yet both carried kingdoms. In the silence between their words, Charlemagne bent his head, not in defeat, not in submission, but in understanding that no king is crowned alone. The Pope's hand rose, a blessing spoken in Latin, a promise woven in breath and frost. Behind them, Rome waited. Old stones, old prayers, old ghosts. Ahead of them, Christmas morning waited. A crown waited. A new name waited. Emperor of the Romans. The road to Rome ended not at the gate, but at an altar, not with a sword, but with silence, not with conquest, but with the binding of old dreams to new hands. The gates closed behind him. Rome swallowed the king, like a candle flame drawn into old stone, narrow streets, frozen breath, pilgrims huddled by shrines, whispering prayers to saints who had never seen a Frankish crown. The night before the crowning was not filled with feasting. No trumpets, no banners unfurled in moonlight, only footsteps, soft on marble floors, only voices, low like the wind. Through broken arches, dot, dot. In the basilica, candles flickered, 1,000 flames, trembling like hope. In the dark, the walls rose high, columns older than kingdoms, mosaics of Christ, watching in silent judgment. Charlemagne knelt alone, no throne beneath him, no crown upon his brow, only the chill of ancient stones. His hands rested on cold knees, his breath slow, his thoughts a river winding back to childhood, to Pippin's stern gaze, to Carloman's empty chair, to forests that burned because one boy had dreamed of empire. Outside the basilica, Pope Leo prayed. His lips moved fast, Latin words wrapped around fear and ambition. He feared the Romans, who whispered of his sins. He feared the king, who could take his throne with a word. But he feared most the silence between his prayers. The city waited, streets dark, but alive with rumor. Some said the king would take Rome and never leave. Some said the Pope would bind him in iron, not gold. Some said the old emperors would rise from their tombs and drag them all into the dust. The king did not sleep. He walked the halls of the Lateran palace. Old walls breathed stories into his bones. Caesar slept here once, or so they said, yet now his empire was a ghost, whispering through cracks in marble floors. He paused at a window, looked out at the dark city, dot, dot. Rome, too vast to hold, too old to bend. A lion that might lie at his feet or tear him when the crown touched his brow. Alcuin's voice echoed in memory. A crown is iron before it is gold. Outside the city walls, fires burned. Pilgrims and soldiers camped under frost-heavy tents. They dreamed of glory, of a king reborn as emperor, of riches flowing north, like wine from a cracked barrel. But here, in the hush of the basilica, there was no glory, only the scrape of sandals on stone, only the scent of wax and incense. The choir practiced softly, boys' voices rising, like a single breath held in the arches, Latin words that tasted of eternity. Gloria in excelsis Deo et in terra pax. He remembered his mother, Bertrude's tired eyes, watching him from a doorway as the crown of Francia settled on his brow. She had seen the wars. She had seen the Saxon blood run like river water into black soil. Would she have wanted this? A son anointed not just king, but emperor. A word that swallowed worlds. Midnight came. Rome did not sleep. The Pope whispered with priests behind wooden doors. Advisors argued over titles. Some wanted to call him Caesar Augustus, a name heavy with marble ghosts. Others wanted a new name, Emperor of the Romans, King of the Franks, a bridge of iron between old world and new. In the garden courtyard, snow fell, flakes drifted into the fountains, no sound but the hush of winter and the distant howl of a Roman dog, a name heavy with marble ghosts. Charlemagne walked alone. A servant offered him wine. He refused. No toast. Before the crown, his thoughts circled like wolves. Around the fire would the Saxons bow to an emperor when they had bled to deny him as king? Would the Lombards obey when old grudges still festered like wounds? Would the Pope remain loyal once the crown was settled and Rome remembered its own pride? He touched the hilt of his sword, joyous, a blade that had tasted Lombard steel, Saxon bone. Yet tomorrow it would hang silent beside robes of silk and rings of gold. In a small chapel, he found a monk asleep, head on folded arms, a candle guttering low. Charlemagne laid his cloak over the boy's shoulders, a king who knew that empires begin with quiet kindness. More than iron, outside the bells waited, silent for now, but ready to call the faithful. At first light, a crown waited too, resting in a locked chest, gold and iron both. Charlemagne looked to the sky. Stars burned above the basilica dome, old emperors looking down, saints looking up, and between them a man, just a man, balancing a world on tired shoulders. Before dawn he prayed again, not for power, not for glory, but for the strength to hold this realm when swords rust and tongues betray. The choir's voices rose, candles flickered higher, the city exhaled as the night before the crowning bowed its head and gave itself to history. Morning came like a soft bell ringing through frost. Rome woke slowly, a city wrapped in candle smoke and whispered prayers. The pilgrims gathered first, hushed voices, cold breath rising to the arches. They knelt on stone that had held emperors and martyrs alike. The basilica doors opened wide, a flood of light poured through the nave. Incense drifted, white ghosts winding through marble columns. The choir began soft, then swelling, voices weaving threads of Latin into the bones of the church. Gloria in excelsis Deo et in terra pax, a chant older than any crown. Charlemagne stood in shadow, not yet king, not yet emperor, just a man holding his breath at the edge of time. He could feel it, the weight of eyes, thousands watching, hoping, fearing. The Pope moved like a whisper through the sanctuary, gold robes brushing stone, a trembling hand carrying the oil, the same oil that once anointed kings who fell to dust. The Frankish nobles waited, swords left at the doors, voices caught in the hush. This was not their hall, this was not their law. This was Rome, older, colder, stronger than any blade. A boy lit candles at the altar, each flame a prayer, each flicker a promise, each drop of wax a memory of the old world. Being poured away, the king stepped forward, boots echoing like drums down the marble floor. His shadow fell across pilgrims who bowed low as if his cloak might shelter their sins. He paused at the great cross, a man of iron before a God of mercy, his hands folded, his eyes lifted. No crown yet, no thunder of horns, just breath, just silence, just the sound of Rome holding its own secrets. Outside, snow fell, soft as lamb's wool, on broken statues and sleeping dogs. The city, a cradle and a tomb. The Pope's voice rose like dawn Latin words, smooth as river stones, carving paths through centuries. He spoke of kings who bend the knee, not to Rome, but to heaven. He spoke of kingdoms that crumble when pride takes root. He spoke of faith as the mortar between bricks of empire. Then the oil, cold on Charlemagne's brow, a line drawn from crown to crown, a bridge of blessing. No sword clanged, no enemy fell. Yet in that moment, a world shifted. The choir chanted louder, candles flickered. In time with voices, the crown waited, heavy, silent, in the Pope's hands. Charlemagne did not reach for it. His hands remained at his sides. His heart thundered like hooves on frozen ground. The Pope lifted the crown, a hush, deep as a grave, soft as snow, on a broken blade, and then lowered it onto the king's head. In that breath, a Frankish king became something else, emperor. The word hung, and the arches dot, echoed off marble, settled like dust on every tongue. No fanfare, no roar, just the heartbeat of 1,000 souls who knew the world was not the same. Charlemagne felt its weight, gold and iron, hope and fear, a circle forged from dreams and blood. He did not smile, he did not weep, He stood in the soft glow of candles that would melt long before his memory did. Outside the bells began, one tower, then two, then all of Rome rang with the news. A new emperor, a new age. But inside the basilica, the emperor was just a man with frost in his beard and prayers in his throat. He turned to the people, faces wide-eyed. Some knelt, some whispered, some wept for reasons they could not name. The Pope raised his hands, a blessing that wrapped the emperor in robes of faith, and in the shadows, old Rome watched. Statues crumbled, columns cracked, but the idea, the ghost of empire, breathed again. In this Frankish king, no Caesar's laurel, no Roman eagle, just a simple crown, forged by need and carried by faith. The choir's voices broke over the gathered masses, soft, endless, a lullaby for a restless world. Outside, pilgrims knelt in the snow. Torches flickered in the white hush. Some carved crosses into the earth. Some held children close. Some closed their eyes and dreamed of spring. Charlemagne looked at the marble floor. He saw his reflection in the polished stone. A king, an emperor, a man. In the candlelight, the crown glowed, a ring of gold, against hair turned silver by winters too long and wars too many. He remembered Wittican, the forests, the rivers red, and then clear again. He remembered Aiken, books waiting, bread rising in warm ovens. He remembered his mother's hands braiding his hair. When he was only a boy with no throne, a voice spoke in his mind, not with banners, not with blood, but with silence. The people sang, the Pope prayed, the Emperor closed his eyes. In that darkness, a vision, an empire not held by spears, but by trust, a crown not forged by iron, but by hope. World not ruled by fear, but by the quiet belief that peace could live in the hearts of those who listened. The bells called, Rome breathed, and in the hush of that Christmas day a new name took root. The crown rested where it could not be seen, hidden beneath a hood, wrapped in linen, carried like a secret, too bright for sunlight. Rome still whispered. After he left, old walls sighed, with the ghosts of emperors, of traitors and saints, of blades hidden in robes. Charlemagne rode out. Through the broken gates, snow drifted behind him, soft white ashes from a fire he could not see. The people watched him go. Some crossed themselves, ash on their fingertips. Some turned their eyes to the cracked road that led back to the north. The Pope remained. Inside his marble cage, candles guttered low. Incense clung to robes, too heavy with gold. A bargain made, a crown given, an empire born in the hush. A Christmas dawn, the king, no longer just king, held the reins in gloved hands. Leather creaked, snow fell on his shoulders. The iron of the crown pressed cold through linen and fur. His nobles rode behind him. No one spoke, no one dared to break the hush that settled over hooves and breath. The road home felt longer than the road to Rome. Every mile stretched like a question. Will they obey? Will they kneel? Will they rise again when winter melts and the old gods wake? Beneath the trees, the fields lay bare. Frozen rivers cracked under the weight of wagons. Pilgrims limped home, their pockets empty, but their minds heavy with stories that would grow. In the telling, Charlemagne watched the forests pass, bare branches scratched at the sky, an alphabet of runes and roots that spoke of lands no crown could bind. At night, they camped near rivers. Small fires glowed like fallen stars, bread and meat passed from hand to hand. Wine warmed lips, too dry from silence. He dreamed of Aachen, of his sons, learning letters by candlelight, of monks carving the future into parchment while snow whispered at the windows. He dreamed of swords hung high on walls, forgotten when words proved stronger than steel. He dreamed of villages rebuilt, church bells ringing, where once drums thundered for pagan kings. Yet in each dream, a shadow lingered, a man at the edge of a forest, Widukinn's eyes, still storms, still waiting. Some nights he woke to the crack of branches, just a deer, they told him, just the wind, they said. But he knew that the roots of rebellion sleep deep. The crown was heavier than any sword he had ever lifted, not because of iron, not because of gold, but because it bound him to ghosts older than his line. When they reached the edge of Francia, he dismounted. Snow drifted down like a blessing or a curse. He stood alone in the hush, one hand on the hidden crown, 1 foot in the mud of a world he had conquered but not tamed. Messengers rode ahead. The court must know. The scholars must write. The scribes must ink this moment into eternity. Alcuin would ask, did the Pope give the crown, or did Rome take the king? The children would ask, was he now Caesar? Was he now Augustus? Was he now more than mortal bone? He would not answer, not yet. The snow answered for him, soft, relentless, silent, into eternity. Aachen waited, not Rome's marble arches, but warm halls, where bread rose in ovens, ... not basilicas, echoing with ghosts, but cloisters, humming with Latin hymns and the scratch of quills. There the crown would rest, on carved oak into eternity. There it would watch, as laws were written, as schools were built, as rivers carried news to lands still waking from winter ... No army marched to hold this empire, no iron gates could bind it, only trust, only word, only a hush that settled deep in hearts that once knew nothing but the roar of spears. Some would bend the knee out of fear, some out of faith, most because the silence was more powerful than the fire that once burned their villages to ash. The roads grew wide. The Misi Dominici rode again, 2 by 2, iron and parchment. Beside bread and prayer, villages sent tribute. Monks taught boys to shape letters into the seeds of a new age. Priests walked forest paths, cross in hand, eyes watchful for drums that might beat again in the moonlight. And in the great hall Charlemagne sat, sometimes with crown, more often without, hands rough with cold, voice soft with weariness. He listened more than he spoke. He judged less than he forgave. He remembered more than he conquered. The empire grew, stone by stone, law by law, memory by memory, ... In the songs of bards he was Caesar reborn. In the letters of monks he was the light that pushed back the dark. But in the hush before dawn he was just a man who knew that crowns are not iron but burden, that power is not taken but carried, that silence is the strongest fortress. When all walls fall away, when snow melted and rivers ran fast, some whispered the old gods' names. They touched trees. As they passed, they sang songs in hidden groves, but they did not rise. Not yet. Charlemagne's empire held them close, not with chains, but with memory. The crown lay heavy on his table, waiting. He wore it less and less because he knew the truest crown is not gold, but the trust of those who dream when swords sleep. And so he returned to Aachen, a king, an emperor, a father of Europe, who held the world in one rough hand while the other turned pages that would outlive him. The bells rang in Rome, in Francia, in Saxony. They rang for an emperor crowned. They rang for a world reborn. They rang for a silence that would carry the dream. Long after the snow melted into spring, the crown rested on a carved chest of oak, iron and gold. Quiet now, it did not speak, it did not command, it only reminded. In Aachen, the halls hummed with voices, monks with ink-stained hands, scribes hunched over parchment, pages whispering Latin, into the bones of an empire that would outlast. Swords and banners alike, Charlemagne sat by a window of colored glass. Light fell in shards across his hands. They were not the hands of marble Caesars. They were hands of a farmer, a father, a soldier who had tasted cold steel and warm bread. He knew an empire is not held by the weight of iron alone. It grows from roots planted deep in the earth of trust. So he built it, stone by stone, word by word, law by law. He divided the land like bread at a table, counties, each a slice of forest and river, village and field. Counts were chosen, some noble by birth, some proven by blade, all bound by oath. The counts judged disputes under low roofs, where peasants gathered, mud clinging to boots, hopes clinging to words. Above the counts, dukes watched the borders, the marks, where wild lands met the tame, their eyes turned outward, guarding against wolves in human skin. Yet trust alone could not keep men honest, so he sent the Missi Dominici, messengers of the Lord King, 2 by 2. They rode the muddy roads, one churchman, one noble, one eye on the soul, one on the purse. They carried parchments sealed with wax, words like iron, to remind every village that the king saw through forest and fog. In the villages, farmers bowed low, children peeped. From behind skirts, dogs barked at horses that smelled of far lands. The Missi Dominici listened to complaints. They weighed grain to catch the thief who skimmed the tide. They knelt in chapels to hear whispers of a count's broken promise. Their parchment grew heavy with names and deeds. Each word returned to Aachen like a seed. Some seeds grew strong, justice flowering in clear streams and peaceful roads. Some seeds rotted, rebellion brewing, where oaths tasted of ash and winter. Charlemagne read each line. By candlelight, his fingers traced the ink, a map of trust, a net of roots that bound the realm. He did not rule from marble palaces. Alone, his power breathed through abbeys where monks copied books to feed hungry minds. He ruled from the hearths where peasants learned that a fair count was a fortress stronger than stone. In the heart of Aachen, a great hall rose, timber and stone, holding the warmth of 100 fires. Here, nobles gathered. Here, bishops debated, where Christ's law met man's capitularies. Laws like rivers, carved through mountains. They told men how to weigh silver, how to settle blood debts, how to build bridges where floods would wash away the careless. Some laws were old, pulled from Roman scrolls, polished and carried like relics. Others were born new, a breath of mercy. For a widow, a sharp blade. For a traitor, no parchment was final. Each winter, the king listened. Counts traveled days to speak one truth. Bishops carried secrets, wrapped in Latin prayers. In these councils, he heard the bones of his realm creak. He mended what he could. He forgave what he must. Some nights, he wondered, could one man's crown hold so many voices? Could one mind know every forest path, every border river, every field where a wheat bent low? But when dawn came, he rose from furs, boots crunching frost. He sat among scribes, hands rough but steady. He signed his name, a mark stronger than a blade. The empire breathed through Misi Dominici, on muddy roads, through laws, spoken in smoky halls, through prayers rising like warm bread from monasteries, where boys learned to shape letters into P's. Not all obeyed, not all bent the knee, yet most did, because most learned better a count's hand than a warlord's sword, better a letter sealed than a village burned, better a king who listened than a ghost, who demanded. So the realm did not crumble, it spread like vines over stone, it rooted like trees in Saxon soil, it hummed like bees in summer fields. Some called it the Carolingian order, some called it Christendom reborn. He called it a promise that each child would know more than a spear's shadow, a promise that each road would lead not to ruin, but to market, to church, to school. The crown rested on oaken linen, silent, but its weight pressed deep into every mind that spoke his name when the Misi Dominici knocked on doors at dawn. They came with parchment, they came with seals of wax, they came with dust from roads that split forests and crossed rivers swollen with forgotten bones. The Misi Dominici, messengers of the king, 2 by 2, they rode out from Aachen's warm hearth into the hush of villages where news moved slow as sap in winter trees. One wore a cross carved in iron beneath layers of wool, a priest, a monk, a man of letters, and prayers whispered before dawn. One carried a blade, at his side steel worn thin, from border skirmishes, from nights spent watching campfires on the edge of Saxon dark. They came in pairs, always pairs, of balance, soul, and steel, scripture and sword. They were the king's eyes, where the king could not go, the king's ears, where no bishop's walls could hear the groan of a widow or the whisper of a count's betrayal. At dawn they stood at the gates of a village where wood smoke rose through thatched roofs and dogs barked at horses they did not know. Children hid behind fences, old men spat in the snow and watched. Mothers gathered bread and salt, an offering for the strangers who wore no crown, yet carried the king's voice. The Misi Dominici dismounted. One read the parchment, words trembling in the cold air. ... By this seal, this word, this bond, all men shall speak. What weighs upon them ... In the church, farmers crowded in. They clung to cloaks. Boots left slush on stone floors that had heard 1,000 sins and more secrets. One man stood with hands calloused by the plow. He spoke of grain stolen by a steward's son. A woman wept of ties taken twice. A boy knelt, eyes wide, saying nothing, but the priest saw bruises blooming like purple flowers, each word written down, each name etched into lines that would return to Aachen and sleep in books bound with iron clasps. They did not promise justice swift as thunder. They promised that wrongs would not rot unspoken. They promised that the king's shadow fell long across the forest paths where fear once ruled. At night they sat by fires in the Count's hall, wine poured into iron cups. They listened to boasts of loyalty, to oaths repeated, and voices that wavered. When the parchment appeared, they asked for weights, silver measured grain by grain. They asked for lists, names of orphans, numbers of goats, bridges repaired or left to drown in spring floods. They asked questions the Count could not answer. Why does the road lie in ruin? Why does the tithe grow heavy, yet the poor man's bowl stay empty? Why do whispers of bandits loom at the border like weeds? The Count bowed, but his eyes measured shadows. In every shadow, a rumor of revolt. Some nights, the messengers heard laughter, ale foamed. In the village tavern, men laughed at the king's riders, at the parchment's threats. But when dawn came, laughter turned to quiet, as the Misi Dominici stood once more at the church door. They rode on ... Fields gave way to marshes, marshes to woods, where the old gods still slept, under oaks. Sometimes they found crosses broken where the road curved into pagan dark. Sometimes they found a Saxon elder waiting by the path, offering bread with one hand, a blade hidden in the other. They knew the king's law was a river, but rivers freeze in winter and wolves cross ice when no one is watching. So they kept riding. They wrote down names and numbers and rumors like seeds scattered on snow. They returned to Aachen. In spring, boots muddy, faces rough with cold wind, they bowed before the king's chair, not a throne of marble, but carved wood, worn smooth by years of councils. They read the parchment, each word a spark to burn away lies. This steward a thief, this count a coward, this priest a shepherd true, this village a nest of fear that must be blessed or broken. Charlemagne listened, hands folded, eyes clear. He asked for no flatteries. He asked for truth, because truth is the strongest shield. When they finished, he signed his name, a swirl of lines that bound men to mercy or to iron ... In the halls, scholars copied the words. Ink dried while spring flowers opened their heads to the sun. In the fields, men spoke softly of the king's riders, of the parchment that might appear at any door, of the hush that settled over greedy lips when hoofbeats came down muddy lanes. The Misi Dominici were not an army. They carried no siege engines. They built no walls, but they turned fear into law. They turned rumor into roots ... A bridge broke. In spring floods, the king would know. A count skimmed silver from the tithe. The king would know. A Saxon rebel whispered in the dark. The king would know. So men built bridges of stone strong enough to hold the trust of a village. They weighed silver on scales so fair that even widows smiled. They spoke truth to the riders because lies rot faster than bread. In Aachen, Charlemagne slept in a hall lined with books ... Latin prayers and Frankish laws bound together like threads. In a cloak, he knew a crown rusts, iron breaks ... But trust, once sown deep, roots in places no sword can reach. The Misi Dominici rode on ... year after year, winter after winter, each hoofbeat, a promise, each parchment, a map, each seal, a bond, and in the hush of villages waking to dawn bells, people learned justice is not the roar of iron. It is the breath of men who listen. It is the hush of parchment unrolled. It is the word spoken true before the fire goes cold. The crown rested where few could see it, iron and gold, dulled by candlelight, silent, yet it spoke in ways no horn ever could. In Aachen, voices murmured like a river, not soldiers' cries, not the clash of steel, but the scratch of quills, the soft hush of Latin words, flowing from monk to monk, parchment to parchment. Charlemagne walked the halls, at dawn, boots echoing on stone. He paused by open doors, where boys bent low, over letters and numbers, their breath rising in the chill of winter mornings. Here, power did not roar, it whispered. Here, law was not an iron chain, but a thread, binding fields to villages, villages to counties, counties to the crown. He knew that faith and law were roots and branches of the same tree, one reaching down, holding fast to earth, one reaching up, catching light. Misi Dominici brought reports, bridges broken, tithes stolen, counts grown greedy, in the hush of forests. So he listened, not with thunder, not with fire, but with silence that turned men's words into seeds the monks gathered, capitularies, thin scrolls that carried rules. Over rivers and mountains, how many oxen to owe a lord, how to measure grain, so none was stolen, how to name a crime when a knife found flesh. A man wronged could kneel before a count could kneel before the king's parchment. A king knelt only before God and his own memory of what mercy meant. Churches rose, where oaks once stood, bell towers replaced, sacred groves, yet the people still touched bark as they passed, not worship, memory. Faith was the mortar, law was the stone. Neither could stand without the other. In Saxony, some still whispered to the old gods, but their children carried Latin prayers on their tongues and wrote their fathers' names in the margins of holy books. Charlemagne knew faith could be forced. Belief could not, so he built schools where monks taught boys born to farms how to shape words into walls stronger than iron. In courts he sat beside bishops and heard tales of lost sheep, and walls dressed as saints. Some bishops were men of gold and silk, soft hands that never broke bread with the hungry. Some were men who walked barefoot through snow to bless a dying child. He knew which ones carried the true flame. He knew which ones spoke words that turned to rot when the candles died. He forgave where he could. He judged where he must. The law grew like vines on stone. Some branches trimmed, some left wild. When a law failed, he mended it. When a count betrayed, he replaced him. When a border frayed, he sent riders to stitch it back. In the night, he dreamed of roots dot dot, a tree so wide its branches touched every village, every monastery, every Saxon hearth, where a mother taught her child to kneel. The Misi Dominici carried the tree's breath. They rode like wind between trunks and boughs, listening to murmurs marking where rot tried to hide. He knew when the crown turned to dust, when Aken's halls fell silent, these roots might sleep, but they would not die. So he wrote, so he signed, so he listened. He taught his sons, not just the blade, but the book, not just how to command, but how to serve. The monks inked lines by flickering flame, words that drifted across centuries, long after torches burned to ash. Some nights, the emperor stood by the chapel door. He heard boys chant, psalms and voices, unbroken yet by war. He saw candles flicker against stone walls, thick with winter's chill, and he knew empires fall, swords rust, crowns crack, but a mind opened is a seed planted in soil no army can scorch. In every county a farmer rose before dawn bells. A count weighed grain on scales made fair. A monk taught a new alphabet to a boy whose grandfather once raised an axe against the cross. This was how the empire breathed, not with fire, not with chains, but with words passed from father to son, with prayers, soon in Saxon, Frankish, Latin, with law that held together fields and forests, abbeys and border forts, an order, a promise, a hush that bound the people more tightly than iron ever could. Charlemagne sat by the window, quill in hand, eyes on the falling snow. Outside, children played, where once men bled. Inside, he wrote their future in lines soft as snow, yet sharp as steel. He did not conquer alone. He did not rule alone. He did not dream alone. He built so the roots would outlive the crown. The crown rested beside the bed. No silk, no guards, just iron and gold, waiting in the quiet in Aachen. The nights grew longer. Snow settled on cloisters and courtyards, blanketing worries no law could bury. He watched his sons, one bold, one cautious, one already gone, to a grave marked by prayers and regret. Letters came from every corner, counts pleading for grain, bishops debating how best to bind pagans to the cross. He answered slowly, each word a stone laid, where no wall yet stood. Nisi Dominici returned, boots heavy with mud, scrolls heavier still. Justice did not sleep, but he did, and in sleep he dreamed of branches cracking. Under too much snow, a crown is light, when taken, heavy, when held. He had carried it long enough to feel how roots tangle around bloodlines. In the courtyard, boys trained with wooden swords. They laughed, not yet kings, not yet, aware of how a realm splinters when the roots grow thin. He prayed they would remember the hush more than the roar, the word more than the spear, the seed more than the fire. Outside the walls, rivers froze. Inside, a new map was inked on vellum. Counts would rise, dukes would bend, bishops would murmur behind cloistered doors, and the crown would pass to hands not yet scarred by winter's iron. When he rose to speak with scribes, his voice was softer than it had been when he swung the sword. Governance, he knew, was not a fortress, but a flame passed from one cupped hand to another. And if the flame flickered, if winds howled, still the roots waited dot, dot. In this hush, in this slow winter, the empire slept. In parchment and prayer, waiting for the next hand to bear the weight, waiting for the next seed to find soil, waiting for the hush to bloom again. When the snow melted into spring, the city of Aachen, once filled with voices, was quiet now. The footsteps in the halls were fewer, the candles burned slower, and the man who once crossed mountains, who faced emperors and storms, now walked with care. His name was still spoken across kingdoms, but in his chambers he spoke less. Charlemagne was old, his beard now white, his eyes deeper than before. He still rose before the sun, still knelt in prayer, still read the Gospels by candlelight, but his hands trembled, his legs slowed, and the air around him carried the weight of memory. In the early morning, he would stand by the window, listening to the bells, soft and distant, watching the steam rise from the baths below, feeling something like peace. He had built an empire, crowned in Rome, father of kings, defender of the church, but none of those titles warmed the bones. None of them brought back time. He no longer rode. The horses remained in their stables. He no longer wore armor, only wool robes lined with fur to hold in the cold. The cold came sooner now and lingered. Winter settled early in Aachen that year. The snow came and did not leave, and in the stillness the emperor remembered. He remembered his youth before the wars, before the sword, before the crown, a boy in the Frankish countryside, chasing birds, climbing trees, watching his father ride off with banners in the wind. The wind, it still whispered through the palace stones, but its voice was older now, like his own. He walked through the hall of relics, touched the wood of ancient saints, stood beneath the great dome where the light streamed down, soft as breath. He did not think of battles. He thought of hands, the hands that built these walls, the hands that dug the roads, the hands that carved his name into history and then forgot it. Time was not an enemy, it was simply the thing that moved on when no one was looking, and now it was almost ready to move again. Without him, he did not fear it. He had feared death once, in his younger years, but not now. Now, he feared forgetting that what he had built would fade like snow upon the tiles. And yet even that fear was soft now, like the hush of incense in the chapel, like the closing of a book, like the dimming of the candle. His sons came to visit, some strong, some proud, some uncertain. He looked at them and saw not rulers, but children just learning how to walk. He spoke little, he listened, and when they asked for advice, he offered silence first, then one word, steady. Be steady. The world will always turn. You must not lose your balance. The days were long now, not with burdens, but with space, the kind of space that fills a room when no one else enters. The emperor rose early, not to lead councils, not to receive ambassadors, but to read. He surrounded himself with books, scrolls from Rome, manuscripts from Ireland, psalms written by candlelight, copied by monks with shaking hands. He read them slowly, tracing each line with his finger, feeling the ink as though it could speak. The words comforted him. not because they gave answers, but because they asked nothing. In his youth he read for knowledge. In his age he read for stillness. The library became his chapel, the turning of pages, his prayer. Sometimes he would pause on a single phrase and repeat it aloud, letting the echo rest in the stone around him. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. He did not mourn his empire. It was strong still. His officials managed the lands. His laws held firm, but he mourned something less visible. The passing of the first dream, the dream that one man could shape a continent. That vision had driven him through decades of war and miles of marshes. But now he wondered, had the people changed, or had they only bent? Had belief taken root, or had fear simply settled deeper in the soil? He walked slowly to the chapel each evening. The bells rang across the rooftops, dot, dot, faint, hollow, beautiful. The monks bowed as he entered. He asked them not to stand. He sat among them, not above them. He sang the chants, not with strength, but with memory. The words rolled off his tongue, not as declarations, but as sighs, dot, dot. One night, a young monk dropped a book. The echo startled the birds above the rafters. The monk turned red, eyes wide with fear. But the emperor only smiled. "It is good," he said softly. "Books should make noise sometimes." That evening, he remained in the chapel long after the monks left. The candle burned low. The shadows deepened. And in that quiet, he remembered his father, Pepin, small in stature, but vast in will. He had set the path. Charlemagne had walked it. And soon, someone else would follow. He looked up at the stained glass window. It showed Christ on the cross, but it was not the suffering he saw. It was the stillness, the moment after the cry, but before the silence. That was where he lived now, not in agony, not in triumph, but in that breathless pause between what was and what comes next. When he returned to his chambers, the fire had gone out. The coals were dim. He did not call for servants. He simply wrapped himself tighter in his cloak and lay down, not to sleep yet, but to listen to the wind outside, to the creak of beams, to the crackle of memory. And as his eyes closed, he thought of a stream he had once crossed as a boy, cold and clear, its stones worn smooth by time. Time was the river, and he was only passing through. The days blurred, winter did not end, not truly. The sun returned to Aachen, but the wind stayed cold. Charlemagne sat longer now, in the garden courtyard beneath leafless trees. The fountains were still, the birds fewer, dot, dot, and yet the silence pleased him. He no longer looked for signs, he listened for endings. His sons came often, Louis, thoughtful, pious, dot, dot, Pepin. Gone now, Charles the younger, too proud. They sat at his table. They spoke of borders, of nobles, of men who would not obey. And he said little. He had once known every name, every count, every duke. Now he forgot some and did not mind. He looked at his sons and saw not rulers, but children. They debated law and land, but they did not yet understand the burden of peace. Conquest had been simple, glory always loud, but holding the world together required quiet hands and patience. And waiting, he took Louis aside one evening. They walked the halls, just the two of them. Their footsteps echoed beneath the vaults. "You must not rule from the throne alone," he said. "You must rule from the chapel, from the school, from the fields." Louis nodded, but Charlemagne saw the uncertainty in his eyes. He placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You will not understand everything, and that is how you will grow." That night, the emperor returned to his writing table. He opened a small book, bound in leather. Inside, no laws, no victories, only thoughts. One sentence per page. Some were prayers, some were regrets, some were just names. He turned to a page marked with a thread. It read, "Power is not what we build, it is what we leave behind." He closed the book. The fire flickered. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang once, and he remembered Rome, the crown, the echo of the people's voices. In the great basilica, Charles, Emperor of the Romans, and he wondered, did they mean it, or had it simply sounded good? A letter arrived the next morning. News from the southern frontier. A skirmish, a refusal, a breach of trust. He read it once, then laid it aside. "Let the local counts manage it," he said. "They must learn to hold the world without me." And so he returned to the courtyard, sat beneath the pale sky. A servant brought him a cloak. Another brought warm wine. He thanked them both and said no more. The wind stirred the dead leaves, and Charlemagne let them fall, just as everything else must. Winter returned. This time it did not leave. The snow lay thick on Aachen's rooftops. The river slowed dot. The trees stood bare, and the emperor did not rise. His servants entered quietly. The fire had burned low. He lay beneath heavy blankets, still breathing, but with effort. A scribe was summoned. A priest followed. The chapel was prepared, but he asked not to be moved. "Let me stay," he whispered. "Let the light come to me." And so they opened the shutters. The pale sun drifted in and touched his face. He closed his eyes, not in fear, but in peace. He had ruled for nearly 5 decades. He had crossed rivers, forged alliances, buried enemies, crowned kings. He had built cathedrals and burned shrines. He had baptized thousands and lost more. He had prayed in silence and spoken in thunder. He had been called great, but now he only wanted rest. The priest read softly beside him, psalms of comfort. "The Lord is my shepherd. Though I walk through the valley," he breathed, then again, then no more. The emperor was gone, and the room grew still. Not empty ... but full of memory. The fire gave one last crackle, and then silence. Word spread slowly. Monks wept in candlelight. Nobles stood without speaking. In Rome, bells tolled for an hour. In Saxony, no bells rang, but the trees seemed to bow. Charlemagne was buried in Aachen, not in a golden tomb, but seated in his chapel, on a stone throne, his sword beside him, his crown in hand, his book resting on his lap. The people passed in silence, not out of fear, not out of duty, but out of awe. The man who had shaped Europe had returned to the dust, and the empire would move on, but slower ... as if waiting to see if he would rise again. And in the centuries that followed, his name remained not just in books, but in whispers, in the curve of an arch, in the chant of a song, in the silence between bells. Charlemagne, Emperor of the Romans, King of the Franks, the man who carried Christ to the forests and brought law to the wild. He was gone, but the echo remained, and in that echo, Europe still dreams. The great hall in Aachen stood quiet, the throne untouched. The stone was cold, the banners hung still, the torches flickered without a breeze. Charlemagne was gone, but his presence lingered like breath on glass. The bells rang low, not in triumph, but in reverence. Louis, his only surviving legitimate son, now wore the crown, not with pride, not with fire, but with weight. A crown passed by blood, but also by silence. Louis had walked these halls as a boy. He had studied under monks. He had memorized prayers, but now he sat on the seat where his father once ruled. The same stone, but not the same man. The council gathered in whispered voices, counts, bishops, advisors too old to stand without help. They waited for commands, but Louis gave none. He asked questions instead. He listened longer than they expected. He wrote notes in his own hand. And in those first days, the empire did not fall, but it did shift. Louis was not his father. He did not shout. He did not ride at the front of armies. He did not stare down kings. He prayed. He consulted. He hesitated. Some said it was weakness. Others said it was wisdom. In the monasteries they whispered, "A crown is heaviest when worn in peace." Louis ruled from within. His court was quieter. He walked the halls of Aachen not like a conqueror, but like a guest. The city no longer rang with the sounds of marching feet. Instead, it hummed with the slow rhythm of rebuilding. Yet even in stillness, shadows grew. His brothers, Pepin and Charles the Younger, had died before him, but their sons still lived, nephews, men with ambition, and blood close to the throne. Louis looked out over the empire map, spread across the table in the war chamber. Mountains, rivers, borders drawn by his father's sword. What paper was not stone. Ink faded, loyalties shifted. He knew the empire would not stay whole forever, but still he would try. At night, he walked alone in the chapel, the same one his father built, the same candles, the same golden altar, and there, in the hush, he would kneel, not to ask for victory, but for clarity. He ruled, not as Charlemagne reborn, but as Louis, the son, the listener, the one who came after. The throne still stood, but the foundation beneath it had begun to shift. Louis ruled, but he ruled over sons and nephews and nobles who remembered Charlemagne's voice. Louder than Louis's prayers, the empire stretched wide, from the Atlantic to the Elbe, from the Pyrenees to the Danube. But what held it together was no longer steel. It was belief, and belief was harder to command. Louis tried. He issued reforms called councils of clergy. He invited scholars and translators and monks who knew the old Greek. He dreamed of unity through learning, not fear. He walked softly where his father had marched, and many did not understand this softness. The nobles grew restless. They wanted land, they wanted inheritance, they wanted the loud certainty of Charlemagne's day, but Louis offered structure, legality, patience. His court became a place of quiet minds, but the lands beyond it whispered rebellion. His own sons, 3 born of his queen, Ermengarde, grew into princes with ambition. Lothar, Pepin, Louis the Younger, each bold, each trained, each aware that one day this great body of empire would have to be divided. Louis the Pious, they called him, pious because he chose mercy, but mercy does not silence hunger. He sensed the future in their eyes, saw the sharpness, the calculations behind their bows. He remembered his own father's plan to split the empire between brothers. It had failed, war had followed, but now Louis feared he must do the same. The burden grew, not in battlefields, but in council rooms, not in marshes, but in maps. He prayed more often, not for victory, but for peace that would last. He would gather his sons, try to teach them unity, try to make them see the danger of dividing what had been whole. But he knew men do not always hear, even when they listen, and empires do not remain still in the hills. Rumors stirred. Local lords tested their strength. Old pagan symbols returned in whispers. The world was moving again, but not all movement leads forward. The stones of Charlemagne's road were beginning to wear, and Louis could feel the dust beneath his feet. The sky above the empire once held a single sun. Now it cracked, not all at once, but in lines too fine to see. Until they spread, Louis the Pious had hoped his sons would rule together, that they would share what was vast. That unity could be taught as Scripture is taught, but sons are not verses. They are fires. First came the whispers, then the letters, then the camps. Brother looked to brother and saw not family, but rival. Lothar wanted the imperial crown, Pepin, lands in Aquitaine. Louis the Younger, control of the East. Their father still lived, but already they moved without him. Treaties were drafted, and then broken. Vows were spoken and forgotten. Louis called them to Aachen. He spoke slowly, with tears in his eyes. "You are not enemies," he said. "You are the pillars of one house." But the house already had too many doors, and behind each a throne. Armies formed in the south, banners unfurled in the north. Men marched, not against invaders, but against kin. The empire, once united under a single name, began to tear itself apart. Monks and monasteries prayed louder. Bishops pleaded for peace. The poor simply waited. Louis no longer rode out. He sent envoys. He sent parchment. He sent hope, but hope arrived too late. His sons met on the field, near Fontenoy, and there, brother fought brother, the grass drank deeply. The banners sagged in the heat, and the cries were not of glory, but grief. Louis received word days later. He said nothing at first. He looked at the map again. The ink was smudged. The borders bled. A servant tried to relight the fire, but Louis raised a hand. "Let it go out," he whispered. That night, he wrote one final letter, not to a king, not to a court, but to God It was not long, just a few lines. I tried to hold what could not be held. I tried to bind what was meant to drift. Forgive me. Let them find their own way. The wind outside howled through the stone, and within the palace, something faded. Not a man, but a vision. The empire did not end with a fall. It ended with a division, quiet, legal, deliberate, not with the clash of armies, but with pens, with scrolls, with signatures beneath flickering candlelight. In the year 843, the sons of Louis the Pious gathered, not as brothers, but as rulers. They met at Verdun, not in joy, not in mourning, but in necessity. The empire of Charlemagne was carved into three. Lothar received the Middle Kingdom, a long, fragile strip of land stretching from the North Sea to Italy. Louis the German took the east. Pepin's line, the west, one empire, now three. The Treaty of Verdun marked a moment, a quiet funeral. For unity, monks copied the treaty in scriptoria. Historians took note, but the people simply woke the next day and went on living. Farmers still tilled the earth. Blacksmiths still worked their fires. Mothers still held their children. They did not see the lines, but they would feel the tremors. For centuries, the empire became legend. Charlemagne's name was carved into cathedrals, soon in Latin, taught in schools. But his world was gone. What remained was shadow, a shape traced in memory, a road that others would try to walk again. Holy Roman emperors would rise, kings would claim descent, but none would be Charlemagne. And in Aachen, his chapel still stood. Pilgrims came, they lit candles, they whispered prayers at the throne. Empty now, the throne that had seen unity and then watched it slip away. The echo of empire still hummed in the stones, not as command, not as doctrine, but as a lullaby, a memory before sleep. And if one stood long enough in that chapel, they might hear it, not words, not songs, but the deep hush of something once great that did not vanish, only faded like the last light at the end of day.